What does it really mean to trust somebody? What do you feel when you feel safe with somebody? Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me. That's an interesting question. What does it feel like to feel safe? How do you know when you really trust somebody? It's such a huge topic, issue for people that have experienced childhood trauma. And truthfully, it's an issue for a lot of people generally. But when it's tied to childhood trauma, there are so many layers to what it means to really trust. We can trust somebody in a more intellectual way, but our body may not at all be on board. Or our body may be somewhat numb, and so that our thinking then seems to feel like it's safe to trust. So it really can be kind of complicated, and learning to trust other people and yourself both are important parts of healing. Trusting yourself is a really huge topic and something that takes a lot of time and practice to do, to really learn to feel safe in being able to trust yourself. But I'm not necessarily really going to talk about that today. Today, I want to talk about relationships and trust. So it is interesting how we can be kind of on two different sides, and we tend to be either or, but sometimes it just depends on the circumstances. We might do a little of both. And one is just recognizing that we have difficulty trusting anybody under any circumstance. The other side of that is kind of feeling like we just kind of naturally and automatically trust people. And what's interesting in that is that so often, and I've seen this in my work, and even I think for myself, it's not so much about trusting people as it is about kind of a sense of acceptance of being hurt. So what I mean by that is that when you have an expectation that people are untrustworthy, that you're undeserving of being treated well, or having good things in your life, you go through your life kind of with that expectation, and it may not be a conscious expectation. So you'll still allow yourself to engage with people, maybe even share some personal information with people, but it's not necessarily because you feel this grounded sense of trust in the person or situation. It's because you kind of resigned yourself to, well, this is just what's going to happen. And there are a lot of people who find themselves there. And then when something bad happens, they blame themselves and take that as evidence that that's what is meant for them in their life. So on the other side of that, where we have difficulty trusting people, we're consciously aware that we have difficulty. We feel uneasy in our body when we think about trusting people. That's a little bit more what I want to talk about today. So it really is natural, because of the developmental aspect of what it means to be a survivor of childhood trauma, that we naturally kind of distrust people. They don't have to do anything specific for us to distrust them. And I also want to clarify that there's a difference between the learned response of distrust and an intuitive sense of distrust. And that goes more along with learning to trust ourselves. So I'm not talking about intuition, but just this sense of just not being able to trust people, this feeling or thought process of all the reasons why you can't trust people. So, and it can be confusing, because sometimes it's hard to know, is it my intuition or is it my fear? And that's a much longer conversation than what I'm going to get into right here. But this is something that actually comes up a lot when I'm having conversations with clients one-on-one, or even in group settings. It's often a question that comes in. So being able to recognize your level of distrust of people is important, because some people kind of just casually will trust the people out in their life. But when it comes to close relationships, they may not trust. Or for some people, you don't trust anybody under any circumstance. Like, you're not even going to trust the mail person to deliver your mail correctly. And I don't know why that came to mind. Maybe it's because I have an issue with my mail carrier delivering my mail properly. But like, just really generally not trusting anybody, right? Like, you could be walking down the street and another person, very non-threatening kind of person, is walking on the other side, and you just immediately think they're up to no good. So that can certainly happen. And it's not even about being like paranoid. Of course, people can be paranoid about something like that, but I'm not talking about paranoia, just kind of reading into things. And part of the reason we do that, again, is to reinforce that the world is not safe. If you've watched many of my videos, you've probably heard me talk about how our belief system that we develop as a result of being traumatized, particularly by people that we trust, is that we create this worldview, this set of beliefs that tells us that the world is unsafe, that people can't be trusted, that you're meant for bad things to happen to you, right? And so that when you're going out in the world, you are kind of scanning, because it's all about self-protection. You're scanning for the things to pick up on, to know that you can't trust that person. What I really want to focus on, though, is when we're trying to build relationships. So whether it is even like a co-working relationship or a friendship, and certainly a partnership, romantic partnership, trust really does play a significant role. And again, recognizing the difference between conscious thoughts and the unconscious drives that are affecting things. So conscious thoughts are the things that you're aware that you're thinking. Like, if you see somebody on the other side of the street and you're saying to yourself, why are they out at this time of day, or something like that, or why aren't they working, or whatever. You're aware that you're having those thoughts. The unconscious drives would be seeing somebody and immediately having this reaction, but you're not aware of any specific thoughts about that. You're just aware that you're having a reaction. Maybe you feel afraid, maybe you feel tense, maybe you feel this intense sort of, or this heightened sense of agitation. Like, it could be any number of things, but you may not necessarily be aware of what it is that's causing it. So, and again, the things that we are not as conscious of have the most impact on us. So being able to recognize how your fear or how your distrust shows up can be really important. And one of the things about fear is that it is almost always going to show up in your body. You may not be aware that it's showing up in your body. You may not be aware of the sensations that are happening, but there is often something happening in your body, because fear is a response to do something so that you're not in danger. For a lot of people, you are aware that there's something happening in your body, whether it's a freeze, sort of numbing, or an intense desire to run away, to shut down, to respond, whatever it is, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. All of that can be going on, not necessarily all at the same time, typically for one person, but any of those things can be happening. So then, what do you do about it? So in the case of building a relationship with somebody, in order to really grow that relationship, in order to feel safe, you're going to be taking some risks, right? Whether it is asking somebody out on a date, or telling somebody how you feel, sharing something that's really personal or difficult. Those are all risks, because you don't know how that person is going to respond. even if you don't see it as a risk, your heart and your body are likely feeling that it's a risk. And building relationships, deepening relationships does require risk. It requires vulnerability. And inherently, risk is part of vulnerability, which is why it's vulnerable. So, thinking about ways that you can risk that vulnerability intentionally in small ways, building your way up. So if you're building a new friendship, right? Like even just approaching somebody or bringing up the conversation of, hey, I'd love to send you a message and maybe we can get together for coffee. That's a risk, right? Because what if that person says no thanks, or maybe even is rude about it? That's obviously not going to feel good. But when you can be deliberate about taking that chance, and let's assume the person is going to respond in a positive way, it's important then to be able to allow yourself to feel into that sense of surprise or relief or happiness, peace, connection, whatever it is that happens, being intentional about being present with that. Because you've spent likely the majority of your life living in this kind of constriction about protection, right? Wrapping yourself up so that nothing outside of you can hurt you. And so even when something good happens, because there's this intense constriction, nothing good can penetrate that, right? We can't really let anything good in if we have everything wrapped so tightly. So when you have an experience where something positive happens, or at least neutral happens, being deliberate about leaning into that feeling and that truth of that experience. So being able to say, okay, that felt really nerve-wracking and I wasn't sure what the outcome was going to be, but she actually seemed excited, and so it worked out well. Really letting yourself feel the truth of that. And what I mean by feel is literally in your body, feel the ease, the release, because if you were worried about how it was going to turn out, your muscles were likely tight, you might have been breathing in a very shallow way. Then when the outcome is positive, you can then take a deep breath, right? You've got more expansion. You can take a deep breath. You can realize like, okay, that fear that I was having isn't warranted. And you can breathe through that and take in that feeling. But this truly is something that we have to practice over and over again, practicing it with different people or different scenarios, with different depths of vulnerability. In my course, Journey to Wholeness, there's actually, I don't really advertise this because I know it can be like something that would shy people away from it. But because vulnerability is such an important part of healing, one of the chapters in Journey to Wholeness, we talk about vulnerability. The focus is on vulnerability because it is so necessary for healing, but intentional vulnerability. So if you have a friend and you've thought about sharing how you really feel about something, but you're afraid you'll be judged, if you never share that with somebody, you will be able to continue to believe that what you feel is not okay, and that if anybody knew, they would judge you for it, because you have no evidence to the contrary. Instead, you have what you believe is evidence, because when that fear dictates what you do or do not do, the fear then says, see, now we're safe because you didn't do that thing that you were thinking about doing. So this is how we stay safe. And again, this isn't necessarily happening consciously. In fact, it rarely is happening consciously. But that's what's happening. So the only way we can begin to change that is by being intentional about how we're choosing to be vulnerable and with whom. And choosing who to be vulnerable with is a really important thing. And this comes back to the idea of trust in general. So when you're looking at this, now you may not feel safe necessarily with this person, meaning that your body can still feel uneasy. You might feel really anxious if you're thinking about saying something. Our body is not always a great indicator of that when we have experienced trauma. But what you can do is look at the situation, the relationship, somewhat objectively, and think to yourself, okay, how does this person show up with me? Do they seem authentic? Have they shown me in some ways that they actually care about how I feel or are interested in knowing me? Have they shared things with me? One of the things to look for is, do they talk negatively about other people? Do they judge other people? If so, that person's probably not somebody you want to practice with. But if those other things have been present, even in ways that you may not fully trust, then you can start with something relatively minor that you might share. So maybe you reach out to that person, plain and simple, just reaching out to them first and see how it goes. Maybe you, like if you've had a crappy day, maybe you actually share that you've had a crappy day without having to necessarily go into a lot of detail, and how do they respond to that? Now, again, this is part of why healing is challenging, because physiologically, you may not feel like this sudden, like release and like, oh my God, that's amazing, because your body is still going to be feeling all of that energy of the uncertainty. So recognizing that is important so that you can kind of take a step back and think, okay, my body isn't feeling very good about this right now, but it's because it was scary. And I can feel scared without having to be in a really bad situation, right? So being able to recognize, just because I feel this doesn't mean that the situation is dangerous. And then being able to take in, how does that person respond? Now, a lot of people are going to second guess themselves, or maybe even 10th guess themselves. Like, oh my God, I think I said something wrong. What if they really are judging me, but they're just trying to pretend that they're nice, or whatever. Like, we may say those kinds of things. And that's why it's important to notice what you're saying to yourself about it, and then trying to take a step back and look at it more objectively. Or in other words, doing some reality testing with it. And building that sense of trust is practicing over and over and over again. And this is one of the reasons why having professional support on this journey, I believe, is so important, because you have so many opportunities to continue to practice. Now, of course, it is important to practice outside of that relationship, but just building some sense of safety with the person that you're working with can actually be really, really beneficial, help you feel more grounded in that safety as you go out and practice it in other places. But it really is something that you have to intentionally practice over and over and over and over again. I wish I could tell you that there's some magical way of just being able to feel safe with people in your body. But unless you're completely numb, which is not necessarily safe at all, you're likely going to feel some uncertainty if it's not something you're used to. But part of healing is moving from that intense physiological response, being able to be with that feeling, practice the vulnerability anyway, take in the real life experience that you have that's hopefully appropriate, and replacing what you expect with what you've experienced in this current present time. But getting there is a process of undoing, kind of unlearning your body, unlearning how to respond to uncertainty. Because uncertainty by itself is not a negative thing. But as a childhood trauma survivor, uncertainty feels like life and death. So naturally, your body is in that nervous system response, right? Your body is responding as if there is danger imminent. Even if consciously you're kind of trying to talk yourself through it, if you haven't yet done the somatic aspect of it, integrating, then it doesn't work very well because your body kind of drives everything once your body is engaged. Once your body feels that fear response, your body is kind of driving pretty much everything. So really leaning in and letting your body feel into those times when the vulnerability worked out well, when you were met appropriately, when you were able to realize that as nervous as you were about something turning out badly, it actually maybe turned out good, if not just neutral. So ultimately, not bad, not dangerous. It's not an easy process. It can feel frustrating at times, but that is how we build trust. And learning who to trust in is also part of that. So like I said, how does this person show up generally? When you see them with other people, how are they behaving with other people? How do they talk around other people? And starting with something relatively minor before you jump into sharing something that feels really incredibly vulnerable. And then you just continue to practice. I know it's not easy and it can feel overwhelming. And sometimes, honestly, it can feel like it's not worth it. I've heard many people say that it's not worth it, that they were better off before, because in all reality, relationships are challenging under the best circumstances. There are a lot of unhealed people walking around out there, and unhealed people who are unaware that they need healing especially, don't know how they're showing up. They don't understand how they're showing up. They're not showing up, or they're not understanding how their own stuff is showing up in relationships. And people like that are more likely to be, well, potentially even rude or hurtful, but even kind of dismissive or avoidant, which can still feel hurtful, even if it's not kind of like a particularly negative type of behavior. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important that we talk about all of this stuff. Reducing the idea or the stigma that struggling is somehow weakness. Struggling is human. And the more that we can recognize that and acknowledge what our struggles are and what the wounding may be that caused it without shame, well, the more we can do to heal it. So I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your reactions. Thanks so much for watching. I'll look forward to seeing you next time. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications.